It's a matter of what works best for you and how it works to visualize this problem. All right, now probably the most important part, what are we going to do about it? So creating solutions is critical. Threat modeling is meant to hypothesize what can go wrong in a device. Once you have an idea of what can go wrong, you need to figure out the way to make it not go wrong. There are two main ways to do this: reducing the likelihood or reducing the impact. If you're reducing the likelihood, let's say there is an access control problem where you are able to, we'll just go back to the example where one user can change another user's password. If you take away the likelihood, so you just remove the functionality altogether, or you remove the access control problem, impact would be the same, but there is no way to execute the attack, so the likelihood goes down. If any of you guys are familiar with the CVSS scoring method for vulnerabilities, pretty standard used by most bug bounty platforms, there are the two metrics that are used to consider the score: the impact metric and the exploitability metric. If that exploitability metric goes down to 0, so there's not really any possible way to do something, it's not going to be a finding. Similarly, we can look at the impact. So we'll need to probably look at a little bit of a different example. But we're looking at a problem where someone can use default credentials to access the database on a device. And we look inside that database and we see a whole bunch of PHI, patient health records, sensitive information, date of birth, social security number, whatever it is. That's a pretty bad finding. The way to go about reducing that impact is, for an example, you could encrypt all the data in the database. Use something super strong, something they won't be able to crack, and then, sure, the vulnerability is still there. There is a vector to get into that database, but the impact is not going to be the same. So that's going to come down pretty heavily. Typically, you'll want to see a conjunction of the two to try to reduce it as close to 0 as far as the likelihood and impact. That's not always going to be feasible. Time constraints, technical constraints, so trying to find a good middle ground can be a good approach. Okay, now, once we have all of our threats, we figure out, okay, here's everything that we think can go wrong. Next step is to start mapping them to a solution. We're going to go back to that database example. Databases are encrypted and access is controlled. That's our solution. This does not necessarily mean that this is in place already in the device. Typically, when going through a threat modeling exercise, we're going to build out this huge list of threats. So, step-by-step flow, we'll get a bunch of information about a device. We'll get the device itself. We'll just take a look at it. We won't start doing any hacking or anything yet. And then we just think about everything that can go wrong, and we write down our solutions there. We go back to our client. We say, hey, this is what we think you should do. Is any of this already in place? And they'll say, yep, our database is encrypted. Yep, we think access control is good. Oh, our BIOS settings aren't protected. Great, well, we know something that we can work on before we go into this penetration test. That's going to save us time everywhere. This is not something that usually happens once. Devices are going to change, landscape's going to change, new techniques are going to come out. A new threat that could be a big thing in the past couple of years that wouldn't have been a problem before is someone using AI to try to identify a bigger threat landscape, try to comb through a network more quickly and try to identify weak points. That was not a problem before. And it's hard to say what the next problem is going to be in years. So trying to stay on top of it, trying to continually threat model a device and not just have it be a one and done process is important. All right, once we have done everything with threat modeling, the next step is process review. So did we do a good job? Did we miss anything? Was our framework appropriate? Are our mitigations good? This is all stuff that we need to start thinking about. Usually there are a couple of ways to figure out each of them. The easiest one is just penetration testing. Once you have done the threat modeling, you go in for a full penetration test. You try to tear apart the device and see what you can do to it. If you see that all those mitigations are actually in place, your penetration tester doesn't dig up any findings, then the odds are pretty good that you did a really good job with your threat modeling and initial mitigations. If you go through that penetration test and you start uncovering findings that weren't accounted for in your threat modeling, it's a sign that something went wrong. You need to go back and visit that to understand how those threats slipped through the cracks. Again, emphasizing the point, this has to be a cyclical process. Very oftentimes, when designing a device, we'll work with a client that goes through 3 or 4 iterations of penetration testing and 3 or 4 iterations of threat modeling. And every single time, the threat model can evolve a little bit. They might change some functionality here or there, or redesign a mitigation, go through another penetration test, make sure everything worked. Do the whole process over and over again until they get to a final product that they're happy with. So this constant review, trying to figure out, did we actually do what we came here to do, is really important. All right, now outside of penetration testing, there are a couple other ways to validate that completion. Risk assessments, while fairly similar, are going to be a great way to do that. So you can do an assessment on the risk from the threat itself, or you can do an assessment on the outcome. Anyone has their own approach. There is no one right way. Typically, we like to look at the outcome. It's a little bit more results-based. But we have in the past seen a lot of companies do it against the threats from the threat model to similar success. When we're doing a risk assessment, we're looking at a hypothetical problem or an actualized problem and saying, what's actually the issue? So trying to figure out what is the real impact. A lot of times, and especially with a medical device, it's not necessarily about what the CVSS score is, what the risk is. It's about the impact. When getting a medical device cleared into regulatory market, we'll just pick the FDA and the USA for an example, they're only going to care about how you can hurt a patient. They don't necessarily care about the super cool SQL injection that you managed to pull off, even though it is a very big vulnerability from that perspective of the CVSS score. It can't really hurt a patient, for example, and so the FDA doesn't care. So going through a risk assessment under the context of a medical device or a physical device, a car, whatever it is, everything is going to have its own different standards and different use cases depending on the industry. Next thing is just having an overall risk management approach. There are tons of different standards for risk management depending on the industry, but it's important to just bake it into the process. Threat modeling should be part of it, and it should just run all the way through. Threat modeling, penetration testing, risk assessment, risk validation. 4 general same steps, regardless of the industry. Each has its own nuances, but having that overall risk management approach is going to be a great way to just validate everything was done right. All right, we want to look at some of the main points of this. So, and I know I've probably said it 4 times already, but threat modeling should be done early and often. And this applies not only to a device manufacturer or a consultant, but bug bounty hunters and application penetration testers. You guys are going to have a lot more success if you try to step back and think about what can we do to hurt this, how can we beat up this application before we actually get into the application. You'll find that you start thinking about it a little bit more, and you're guiding yourself into these attacks a lot more than if you just go in blindly, try to run your reconnaissance and see what comes out. Next thing that we have to make sure we're doing is reviewing all of our threat modeling activities. Great to do it, you have to make sure it's done right. If you miss something, that's a sign something went wrong, and you need to go back and again. Diagrams for threat modeling should be relevant to the attack vectors and to the device. You don't need to get into every little bit of detail. You want to look at the main physical components, you want to look at the main logical components and the entry points in and out. You have to understand every process flow, data store, but you don't necessarily have to understand the metal casing. You don't necessarily have to understand the aesthetic lights on the outside. So just keeping it to what's relevant. Methodologies should be carefully chosen. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. If you're a bug bounty hunter on a new program trying to find some nasty findings on a new application, probably going to want to go through the OWASP top 10. They're the top 10 for a reason. They're super common. It might not be as applicable to go through something like Stride, which is a little bit more cerebral and less practical. If you're going on a very experienced program, let's say you're trying to hack into Amazon or Tesla, a very well-developed company, then you might want to rethink that approach. The OWASP top 10 is usually going to be covered by those developers. Now, of course, that's not always the case. Everyone has found some nasty findings on some very established bug bounty programs that are in the top 10. But thinking of a different approach, like MITRE ATT&CK, might be a good way to do it. That can boil down into very, very specific niche use cases that you might not have considered before and might show a little bit more success. Then, of course, if you're working on a web application as opposed to a physical device, as opposed to a pacemaker or a car, whatever it is, you need to think about that. Finally, threat modeling needs to be validated. Penetration testing, risk assessment. You have to go through this whole process. Risk assessment and risk management is a huge, widespread area. And understanding everything that can go wrong, trying to figure out how to validate that can be a complicated process. So whether you're doing it yourself for your own product, or you're a freelance tester, or you're doing it at an organization, having a very stable risk management framework is important to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks, and this is done pretty often. All right, I hope I didn't bore you guys too much. Getting into a little bit of that regulatory intersection can be a little bit dry, but it's very important. Cybersecurity is usually just driven by regulations regardless. Now, I did want to turn it over to the audience to see if you guys had any questions.
Microphone.
Can we give her a mic? Do you have a mic?
When using threat frameworks for threat analysis, how can threats can be identified as comprehensively as possible?
It's a great question. So it gets into that review cycle a little bit. If you go through a penetration test, you dig up something that was not identified in threat modeling, then that means that you messed something up. Now, part of what the tricky area is figuring out if you messed up before that. So that's why blending different threat modeling frameworks can be a good approach. Our standard approach, a lot of devices that we deal with, especially modern devices, are like an AI-enabled diagnosis platform or a software as a medical device. We'll usually use a couple of different approaches. We'll start with the OAuth top 10 to try to tick some easy stuff off the list, move down to Stride, try to get some more complicated stuff, finally finish with MITRE ATT&CK when we really, really want to find everything that can be uncovered there. So I'd say kind of the long and short of it is just trying to blend different approaches and get a little bit more of a wide cast on everything.
Any question?